The airport was bustling with activity, but Eleanor Whitaker could only focus on the emptiness that had accompanied her for 3 years, ever since she'd lost Richard, her husband, in a boating accident. She had never fully accepted his death, and the weight of her grief kept her anchored in the past. As she prepared to board her flight, something stopped her in her tracks. Among the crowd, a familiar silhouette caught her eye, tall, with the same stance she would recognize anywhere. Her heart raced. Could it be him? Or was her mind playing cruel tricks on her again? Without hesitation, she pushed forward. Since Richard had disappeared, Eleanor had developed an obsession with control. Every day started and ended in exactly the same way. She would wake before dawn, make her bed with military precision, and brew coffee as the radio muttered news she barely listened to. The rest of her day was consumed by work, numbers, contracts, endless virtual meetings. Yet no amount of order in her office or her jam-packed schedule could mask the true chaos within her. Eleanor's life was a constant effort to avoid empty spaces, the silence of her home, the absence of Richard's voice, and, above all, the echo of his laughter, which seemed to linger in every corner. But there was one thing no one knew. Tucked away in the drawer of her bedside table was a small wooden box she couldn't bring herself to open. Inside were the last remnants of Richard recovered after the accident, his wedding ring, a waterlogged wallet, and a love note folded in 4. She couldn't bear to face the reality those objects represented. Lately, though, something had shifted. Eleanor felt an unshakable restlessness, as if an invisible weight had grown harder to bear. It wasn't just the grief but the nagging questions she could never quiet. What if? What if Richard hadn't really gone? What if there was something she didn't know about that day? Questions she thought she had buried began to resurface, haunting her in a way she couldn't ignore. The breaking point came with a call from the family lawyer. He needed to discuss the official transfer of a property in Italy, something she had been avoiding for years. "You can't put this off forever, Eleanor," he'd said gently but firmly. Italy. Even the mention of the country was enough to freeze her in place. It felt like all the ghosts she'd been running from for 3 years had been summoned at once. After the call, she spent days debating what to do. Flying to Geneva for the conference seemed like a way to delay confronting everything head-on, yet it would also nudge her closer to the decisions she needed to make. Accepting the trip felt, in a reluctant way, like admitting it might be time to stop running. Now, after days of packed schedules and endless meetings, Eleanor still felt like nothing had changed. She was drained, emotionally and physically. Sitting in a cafe, she watched the constant stream of passers-by, trying to ignore the heavy cloud that still loomed over her. The aroma of coffee mingled with the distant hum of voices and footsteps, but Eleanor's mind was elsewhere. Something about that morning felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Then her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her out of her thoughts. She frowned at the screen. Her mother's name flashed across the display. A call at this hour was unusual, and a wave of unease swept over her. "Mum? Is everything all right?" she answered, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed her anxiety. On the other end, her mother's tone carried a sense of urgency that immediately put Eleanor on edge. "Eleanor, love, you need to come home now. There's been an accident." "An accident? What's happened?" Eleanor stood up instinctively, her heart pounding. "It's James. He's all right, but he's in the hospital." James, Eleanor's younger brother, was impulsive, the complete opposite of her. Although they weren't particularly close, he was family, and the thought of something serious happening to him sent a wave of worry crashing over her. "Which hospital?" "I'm at the airport. I can reschedule my flight," she said quickly, already calculating how soon she could get home. Eleanor, there's something else, her mother interrupted, her voice carrying a weight that made Eleanor's heart race even faster. The accident happened on the road, but he was on his way back from meeting an Italian. Someone who claimed to have information about Richard. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The word Italian echoed in her mind, connecting to a whirlwind of memories and suspicions she had spent years trying to suppress. Information about Richard? Her voice was barely a whisper, as if the words were too heavy to say aloud. Yes, her mother continued. James didn't say much, but apparently, this man approached him directly. He mentioned something about a place on the Italian coast. Eleanor stood frozen as the world around her, noisy, bustling, and full of movement, seemed to fade away. The unease she'd felt over the past few days suddenly made sense. Something was happening. Something she couldn't quite piece together, but that stirred in her a deep sense that it couldn't be ignored. I'm on my way, she said at last, her voice firm, before ending the call. The suitcase in her hand felt heavier than ever. She had no idea what awaited her, but for the first time in years, there was something beyond the emptiness, something pulling her forward, even if it meant facing a fresh wound. Eleanor snapped her phone shut with more force than she intended, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet buzz of the airport. For a few moments, she stood there, staring into nothingness as her mind raced to process her mother's words. Information about Richard. An Italian. James. It all swirled together in a storm she couldn't control. Taking a deep breath, she headed to the ticket counter to change her flight. As she handed over her documents, one thought dominated her mind: the mysterious Italian. Who was he? Why now? The journey back to London was torturous. The plane felt excruciatingly slow, and Eleanor was suffocating under the weight of memories she had tried so hard to bury. 3 years without Richard replayed in her mind, this time tinged with an anger she couldn't ignore. Who was this man? What did he want with James? When she finally arrived at the hospital, the exhaustion of travel gave way to the emotional burden of facing her family. In the waiting room, her mother sat nervously twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Beside her was Aunt Margaret, wearing the same disapproving expression Eleanor had known since childhood. But it was the figure leaning against the far wall that made Eleanor's stomach twist: James, with a bandage on his arm and the same cocky look she hadn't missed. "So, you actually showed up," he said with a smirk, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Shocking, really, considering it's usually impossible to drag you out of your ivory tower." "Don't start, James," Eleanor shot back, her voice firm but measured. "Mum called me. Apparently, some Italian decided to mess with our lives, and you thought it would be a good idea to play detective." "I was just trying to help," he snapped, raising his voice. "Someone has to do something, since you're too busy hiding behind your work and pretending Richard never existed." The accusation hit her like a punch to the gut. Eleanor felt her face flush with heat, but refused to let her guard down. Their mother quickly stood, placing herself between the two. "Enough, both of you. This isn't the time for fighting." She turned to Eleanor, her eyes pleading. He was only trying to help. The man seemed to know something important. Eleanor ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply in frustration. "And you believed him? You always do this. You always jump into things head first, get tangled up in a mess, and guess who has to clean it up? Me." Her voice rose louder than she intended, drawing glances from others in the room. "You want to talk about what I hide? I've held this family together while all of you pretended life was fine, I worked, I burned out, I shut myself away because I was the only one who wasn't allowed to fall apart. Her mother opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. James, however, let out a bitter laugh. Of course. Here we go. Eleanor, the martyr. The ice queen who thinks she's better than everyone else just because she's got a fat bank account and a fancy surname. You don't know what you're talking about, she replied curtly, her voice as sharp as a blade. But inside, she felt shattered. It wasn't the first time she'd heard those words, and she knew they were born, at least in part, from years of built-up resentment. Enough, their mother cut in again, her voice trembling. What matters is that James met this man, and he mentioned Richard. He said there's something we don't know, and that Eleanor has to go. To Italy. The room seemed to spin around her. Eleanor stared at her mother, stunned. Me? Why me? Because he asked for you, James answered, his tone more serious this time. He specifically asked for Eleanor Whittaker. Said there are truths you need to hear. A heavy silence fell between them. Eleanor's heart was racing, every beat pounding in her ears. The idea of going back to Italy was like tearing open an old wound she could barely endure, but it now felt unavoidable. She turned to leave, her coat draped over her arm. Before stepping out of the room, she glanced over her shoulder at James. Next time you decide to save the world, try not to end up in hospital, she muttered dryly. He laughed again, but it was hollow. And you, Eleanor? Are you finally going to face the truth, or keep running? She didn't answer. Deep down, she knew he was right. Eleanor left the hospital with quick, heavy steps, as though she wanted to put as much distance as possible between herself and that conversation. The chill of London's night air felt sharper than usual, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was a storm she couldn't tame. Italy. The country that had taken everything from her. The place where Richard had vanished, where the promises of a happy life had crumbled in a matter of hours. The last time she'd heard that name was when she got the news of the accident. And now, out of nowhere, someone had the audacity to speak of truths about him. Anger simmered within her. Anger at James for meddling in something he clearly didn't understand. Anger at her mother for dragging her into the chaos. But most of all, anger at herself. Because no matter how much she tried to deny it, a small, cruel flicker of hope had begun to take shape. Hope's a curse, she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair as she climbed into a taxi. She needed to snuff it out before it grew, before it consumed her again, as it had in the months after losing Richard, when every unexpected call or unknown letter had made her heart leap. She knew where that path led, to the same unbearable emptiness. Back at her flat, Eleanor flung her bag onto the sofa and paced the room, her thoughts spinning in circles. Why now? Why, after 3 years, would someone come forward with this? Her hands trembled as a rush of heat swept through her chest, memories of Richard flooding her mind. She remembered how he used to tease her about her obsession with control. You don't have to run the universe, Elle, he'd say, laughing as he propped his feet up on the coffee table. Sometimes the universe knows what it's doing. But he was wrong. The universe didn't know what it was doing. The universe had taken him from her, and since then, she had done everything in her power to make sure nothing else slipped out of her grasp. But now, Eleanor didn't know what to do. She sat down at the kitchen table, resting her face in her hands. The thought of returning to Italy was unbearable, like reliving the worst day of her life. And yet, James's words echoed in her head, he asked for you. Said you need to hear the truth. The truth. Eleanor wasn't sure if she wanted the truth. She'd spent years convincing herself she already knew everything she needed to. Richard was gone, and that was the end of it. But what if she was wrong? What if there was more? Hours passed as she wrestled with herself. She'd get up, pace to the window, then return to the kitchen. She picked up her phone to call her mother, only to hang up before the call could connect. Her eyes wandered to the small wooden box tucked in the back of the drawer. Opening it would mean admitting that some part of her still believed there was more to uncover, more to lose. This is madness, she whispered to herself, but she couldn't get Italy out of her head. When the sun began to rise, Eleanor was still awake. It felt as though she was being pulled in two directions. On one side, the anger and pain that had held her back for so long. On the other, the possibility of answers, or perhaps some form of closure she'd never truly had. But even that possibility felt dangerous, like probing at a wound that hadn't properly healed. She picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. A tired and worried voice greeted her on the other end. "Eleanor? You haven't slept, have you?" "No, Mum. I can't stop thinking about it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know if I can go back there. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Her mother hesitated for a moment before replying. "Love, sometimes we have to face our fears, even when it hurts. I know it's been hard. It's been hard for all of us. But maybe this is important." Eleanor remained silent for a long time, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. She knew her mother meant well, but the words didn't feel like enough. After all, neither of them knew what really awaited her in Italy, or whether it would bring the answers Eleanor was so afraid to hear. She hung up without giving a definitive answer. Her mind was exhausted, and the internal conflict felt endless. Something had to break the cycle, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. In the days that followed, Eleanor tried to return to her routine, but it was like walking through a minefield. Every mundane task seemed to remind her of the hospital conversation, her mother's call, and, worst of all, the name she avoided even thinking, Richard. At work, she lost count of how many times she rewrote the same email or botched numbers on a report. "Eleanor, are you all right?" a colleague asked, but she only responded with a mechanical nod. She was far from all right. She was trapped in a cycle of denial and doubt. Her flat, once her sanctuary, now felt oppressive. At night, as she stared at the ceiling, her thoughts consumed her. She tried to rationalize, who was this man? What did he really know? Why, after all this time, had he appeared? But logic brought no comfort, only more questions. To make matters worse, the tension with James and her mother lingered. During a video call, her mother tried to smooth things over, but her voice only reignited Eleanor's resentment. "Do you really think I should go?" Eleanor asked, her expression hard. "I think you should do what your heart tells you," her mother replied cautiously, which only irritated Eleanor further. My heart was shattered 3 years ago. And now you expect me to go to the place where it all fell apart, because some strangers decided to show up with his truths." Her mother sighed. "I know you're hurting, but what if there's something you need to know, Eleanor? Something that might give you peace." "Peace?" Eleanor echoed with a bitter laugh. "You want peace? I'm the only one who's never had the right to grieve in peace, because I had to hold everything together. While you cried, I worked. While James messed things up, I fixed them. And now you want me to drop everything again?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a moment, Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, but she quickly pushed it aside. She wasn't wrong. For years, she had carried the burdens no one else was willing to bear. And yet, the doubt lingered, a nagging presence that grew stronger with each passing day. She avoided looking at the small wooden box, but her mind kept returning to it. Until, in the quiet stillness of another sleepless night, something inside her finally gave way. Rising from her bed, Eleanor switched on the bedside lamp and went to the drawer. Her hands trembled as she retrieved the box. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she rested the weighty object on her lap. For a moment, she stayed there, motionless, before finally opening it. The smell of old wood and damp paper filled the air. Inside, Richard's wedding ring glinted under the lamplight, shining like a cruel reminder. The leather wallet was intact, though weathered by time and water. And then there was the note. Her hands hesitated before picking it up. The paper was worn, the words slightly blurred, but still readable. No matter where we are, we'll always find our way back to each other. I promise. Eleanor's breathing grew heavy. These were the last words Richard had written to her, scrawled on a napkin during a trip to the coast. At the time, she'd laughed at the simplicity of the gesture. Now, those words felt like an unbearable weight. Tears began streaming down her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel everything: the anger, the longing, the emptiness, the unfinished love. And, amidst it all, a question surfaced, persistent and impossible to ignore: what if he really is out there? The next morning, Eleanor couldn't focus on anything. Not on work, not on the calls she ignored. She spent the day in silence, staring out the window, until late in the afternoon when her mother called again. "Eleanor?" Her voice was hesitant. "I know you're hurting, but—" "Mum, I don't know," Eleanor interrupted before she could continue. "I don't know if I can do it." "You don't have to decide now," her mother said gently. "But think about it. Maybe this is the start of something you need to face." After hanging up, Eleanor sat alone in the dark apartment. She picked up Richard's note and read it again. The doubt was still there, but something inside her was beginning to shift. In the days that followed, Eleanor realized her resistance wasn't just about the fear of returning to Italy. It was about facing the possibility that her life could change again, for the worse. Or, perhaps even worse still, for something she couldn't control. The routine she had built over the past few years, as lonely and unfulfilling as it was, felt safe. And now, all of it was threatened by a single phrase: "He asked for you." During sleepless nights, Eleanor found herself replaying memories of Richard. How he always managed to see the bright side, even when her pessimism was at its peak. How he teased her for taking life too seriously. "You only need a spark of courage," he'd often say. That memory irritated her deeply, because now, more than ever, courage felt like an impossible thing to find. Her productivity at work plummeted. Instead of answering emails or reviewing contracts, she spent hours staring out the window, picturing the Italian landscapes Richard had loved. He adored the coast, the salty smell in the air, and he'd always joked that one day they'd move there when they were ready to slow down. We're miles off that, she'd laughed the last time he mentioned the idea. Now, that dream was just a bitter memory. James, as ever, wasn't helping. He sent daily texts, most of them dripping with sarcasm. "Still hiding in your fortress, read one. Hope it doesn't take you another 3 years to decide," said another. Eleanor ignored most of them, but some hit a nerve, especially because, deep down, part of her knew he was right. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon that Eleanor received another unexpected call, this time from an unknown number. For a moment, she considered letting it ring out, but something made her pick it up. Eleanor Whitaker? The man's voice carried an accent she couldn't place immediately. Yes, who's speaking? She asked cautiously. My name is Marco. I'm the one who found your brother, and I'm the person who needs to speak with you. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She stayed silent, her heart pounding. Please, listen to me, Marco continued. I know this must be difficult, but I don't have much time. There are things you need to know about your husband, Richard. Why now? She managed to ask, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Why are you coming forward after 3 years? Marco's tone grew more serious. Because I didn't know the full truth until now. And because his life, and yours, might depend on it. Eleanor felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Is this some kind of cruel joke? She tried to sound steady, but her voice betrayed her. No. I swear it's not, Marco replied, his tone urgent. But if you want answers, you'll have to come to Italy. That's all I can say over the phone. He hung up before she could respond, leaving her in a state of complete turmoil. Marco. His voice echoed in her mind, and the mention of Richard seemed to have unlocked a door she could no longer close. That night, Eleanor sat in her living room for hours, staring at the suitcase she'd packed for the conference. She still didn't have an answer to the question tormenting her: did she really want to know the truth? And if she found it, would it be something she could bear? The next day, she began preparing. Not because she was sure of her decision, but because she felt that if she waited another day, it would be too late. Packing her bag felt almost automatic. She threw in simple clothes, her documents, and the small wooden box. She didn't know why she was taking it, but leaving it behind felt impossible. At the airport, doubt crept in again. Every step felt heavier, as though her body was resisting the inevitable. She moved through check-in, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Sitting in the departure lounge, watching planes take off, Eleanor clutched Richard's note, tucked safely in her coat pocket. The words were faded, but their weight remained the same. We'll always find our way back to each other. She took a deep breath. For the first time, she realized this journey might not just be about finding answers about Richard. It might be about finding herself. Still, the doubt gnawed at her. What if this was all a mistake? What if she was walking straight into more heartbreak? When the flight to Rome was announced, Eleanor hesitated for a moment before standing up. Her steps were slow but deliberate. She was going, even though every doubt and fear clung to her like extra baggage. Deep down, she knew that whatever she found, nothing would be the same when she returned. Eleanor held her phone tightly as she waited in the boarding queue. Marco's name still glowed on the screen, the call ending only moments ago. Her heart pounded as his words echoed in her mind. I'll be waiting for you at the airport in Rome. I'll explain everything there, but you have to trust me, Eleanor. This is more important than you realize. Trust. The word felt impossible. Marco was just a voice, a vague promise she didn't know if she could, or wanted to, believe. But the way he spoke, with that direct, almost desperate tone, suggested he wasn't merely trying to lure her in with lies. There was something about him that felt genuine. Yet her mind kept grasping for reasons to turn back. So she continued pretending. The suitcase, the note, the boarding process, she told herself it was just a logistical error, a continuation of her trip to Geneva. But deep down, Eleanor knew she was going to Rome. She knew she was chasing something she couldn't quite define: hope, closure, or perhaps more pain. As she prepared to board, her steps faltered. Among the crowd, a familiar silhouette caught her eye, tall, with the same posture she would recognize anywhere. Her heart raced. Could it be him? Or was her mind playing cruel tricks again? Without thinking, she moved forward. But just as quickly, she stopped, telling herself it was madness. Whatever it was, she would find out when she reached Rome. She stepped onto the plane in a nervous haze she could barely hide. Taking her assigned seat, she tried to steady her breathing and convince herself she could still change her mind, though she knew it wasn't true. The sound of passengers stowing luggage and settling into their seats offered a brief distraction, until something caught her attention. Looking down the aisle, Eleanor felt her heart jolt. It was him. The man she had seen at the airport, the one whose silhouette had seemed so familiar. He was boarding the plane. He moved slowly, as though he had all the time in the world, pulling a small carry-on behind him. She shrank into her seat, unable to tear her eyes away as he walked past. The way he moved, the casual adjustment of his coat on his shoulder, every detail made her stomach churn. He was so close, yet just far enough that she couldn't confirm what her mind was desperately trying to suggest. The man took a seat a few rows ahead, on the opposite side of the plane. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as the situation began to feel more surreal by the second. Could it be Richard? It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. Logic screamed that it was impossible, but her heart refused to let go so easily. Her head was spinning. If it hadn't been for Marco's call just minutes earlier, she'd be convinced she was losing her grip on reality. The memory of his words brought a flicker of clarity, though it only raised more questions. It was in that moment that she realized she was caught, trapped between the past pulling her back and the uncertain future waiting for her in Rome. Between the possibility of a life that could never be the same and the fear of discovering what was really going on. As the plane taxied down the runway, Eleanor gripped her seatbelt tightly, trying to quiet the storm of emotions raging inside her. The man ahead didn't look back, not even once, but she couldn't stop watching him. When the plane finally took off, Eleanor closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she prayed. She wasn't even sure what for. Perhaps for courage, perhaps for answers. Maybe even for Richard. The flight felt endless. Eleanor spent most of it staring blankly at the screen on the seat in front of her, pretending to watch the film playing, though she didn't absorb a single scene. Her thoughts raced in endless circles, the man a few rows ahead, Marco's cryptic call, the mention of Richard, all of it swirling in a relentless loop. Every now and then, her gaze drifted to him. The man remained still, either staring out the window or fiddling with a book he didn't seem to actually read. The dim cabin lighting cast shadows on his features, so familiar, yet so strange. Eleanor fought the urge to get up, to go to him, but fear held her in place. What if she was wrong? As the captain announced their descent into Rome, Eleanor felt a wave of panic. The landing was smooth, but her heart felt like it was in free fall. While the other passengers stood to collect their belongings, she stayed seated for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. The man was already on his feet, but he didn't glance back. He grabbed his bag and disappeared down the aisle, leaving Eleanor with even more questions. Rome's airport was vast and bustling, but Eleanor barely registered the people moving around her. Each step felt like an effort, as if her body was resisting her decision to be there. Marco had said he'd be waiting, but she had no idea how to find him, or if she even should. As she moved through the arrivals hall, Her eyes automatically searched for the man from the plane, but he seemed to have vanished into the crowd. The realization made her anxiety spike, as though she'd lost something important. And then, she heard her name. Eleanor Whitaker? Turning sharply, she saw a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and dark eyes, holding a small sign with her name on it. He looked as tired as she felt, but there was a steadiness in his gaze. Eleanor hesitated before stepping closer. "Are you Marco?" she asked cautiously. "Yes." "Thank you for coming," he said, setting the sign aside. His voice was exactly as she remembered from the phone call, urgent, but composed. "Before anything else, I need to know, who was that man?" The words tumbled out before she could stop herself. Marco frowned, clearly puzzled. "What man?" "On the plane," she said quickly. "There was a man who," she trailed off, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "I thought. I felt." Marco studied her for a moment but didn't press further. Instead, he nodded towards the exit. "Let's talk somewhere safer." "This isn't the place for it." Although Marco's evasive response irritated her, Eleanor followed him. As they walked to the car park, her unease grew with every step. He opened the door of a modest car and motioned for her to get in. For a moment, she hesitated, questioning whether she should trust him at all. But at this point, she was already there. There was no turning back. Inside the car, Marco drove in silence for several long minutes before speaking. "I know you have a lot of questions. And I'll answer all of them. But first, I need to show you something. After that, you'll understand why I reached out to you." Eleanor wanted to demand answers then and there, but something in his voice made her wait. As the city lights blurred past the window, she clutched Richard's note in her coat pocket, as if it were her only anchor in the storm that was brewing. The car wove through the lit streets of Rome, but Eleanor barely registered the scenery. The city she and Richard had once dreamed of visiting now felt strange and oppressive. Marco kept his eyes on the road, but Eleanor couldn't contain the tension building inside her. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her gaze shifting between Richard's note and the silhouette of the man behind the wheel. "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or do you plan to keep dragging me around in silence?" she finally snapped, her voice sharp. Marco sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I understand your frustration. But I needed to get you out of the airport before saying anything. There are people who are very interested in this story, Eleanor. And not all of them want you to uncover the truth." "Interested?" She frowned, folding her arms across her chest. "We're talking about my husband, a man who disappeared 3 years ago. Why on earth would anyone suddenly care about that?" Marco glanced at her briefly, his gaze a mixture of exhaustion and urgency that silenced her next words. "I promised I'd explain everything," he said steadily. "But I want you to see it for yourself first. There's a place Richard used to go, a place that was important to him." "A place?" Eleanor repeated, suspicion dripping from her voice. "What place? And how do you know about it when I don't?" "Because he was involved in something you didn't know about," Marco replied bluntly. "And because he trusted me, Eleanor. But even I didn't know the whole truth until now." The car turned onto a winding road leading out of the city. The lights of Rome faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet darkness of the Italian countryside. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. With every passing kilometer, everything seemed to grow more surreal. At last, Marco pulled the car to a stop in front of a small, abandoned village. The full moon bathed the ruins of an old stone building in silver light, its walls weathered by time. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of the wind. "We're here," Marco said as he stepped out of the car. Eleanor hesitated before following. The place looked like something out of a nightmare, empty, desolate, yet heavy with an atmosphere she couldn't explain. Marco switched on a torch and led her into one of the crumbling structures. "Here," he said, pointing to a corner of the room. "This is where I found something." Frowning, Eleanor stepped closer. On the ground was a wooden box, partially buried in dust. She glanced at Marco, confused. "This was here?" "Yes," he replied. "And what's inside will help you understand. But it'll also leave you with more questions." Eleanor hesitated before opening the box. Inside was a stack of aged papers and something that made her catch her breath, a photo of Richard, clearly taken recently. He looked older, with a faint beard and a distant expression, but it was unmistakably him. She turned to Marco, her voice trembling. "Is this some kind of joke? Where did you get this?" "I found it here," he said calmly. "And this is just the beginning, Eleanor. There's something much bigger behind Richard's disappearance. And if you want answers, you'll have to dig deeper." Eleanor stared at the photo, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst. For the first time, the idea that Richard might still be alive wasn't just a foolish hope, it was a terrifying possibility. "Are you going to tell me where he is?" Her voice came out as little more than a whisper. Marco shook his head. "Not yet. But you're closer than you think." Her knees felt weak as she continued to gaze at the photo. Every detail of Richard's face was etched into her memory, the lines around his eyes, the slight tilt of his head when being photographed. But something about the image unsettled her. It wasn't just the confirmation that he was alive. It was his expression, dark, weighted, as though he carried a burden she couldn't begin to understand. "If this photo is real, why didn't he come back to me?" she asked, her voice breaking with pain and disbelief. "If he's alive, why did he let me believe he was dead all this time?" Marco regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and hesitation. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Richard was involved in something he never told you about. Something dangerous. I only learned about it because he came to me shortly before he disappeared." "He came to you?" Eleanor frowned, confusion clouding her face. "Why? Who are you, Marco? Why would Richard trust you and not me?" Marco looked away, clearly uneasy. After a moment, he sighed and began to explain. "I work for an organization that investigates international financial crimes. Richard, he came to us because he uncovered something big. Something that put his life at risk." Eleanor's stomach churned. None of this made sense. Richard was an architect. He spent his days designing buildings, not getting tangled up in corruption or whatever this was. "You're saying Richard was caught up in some sort of conspiracy?" "Not exactly," Marco replied. "He wasn't involved, but he stumbled onto something. Something that made him a target. He came to me because he knew he'd have to disappear. It was the only way to protect you, Anne." He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said too much. Eleanor narrowed her eyes and stepped closer to him. "Protect who, Marco? What aren't you telling me?" Marco hesitated, but before he could answer, a sound shattered the silence. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from outside. Eleanor froze, and Marco quickly switched off the torch. He motioned for her to stay quiet, his eyes locked on the entrance to the building. For a moment, there was only stillness, but then the sound of footsteps echoed on the stone floor outside. Someone was there. Marco grabbed Eleanor's arm and guided her to a darker corner of the room. "Stay here," he whispered, before moving away silently. Eleanor pressed her back against the cold wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was racing so fast she feared whoever was outside would hear it. She clutched Richard's photo tightly in her hand, as if it were some kind of shield. Marco returned moments later, moving swiftly. "We need to leave now," he said, scooping up the box and stacking the papers back inside. "Who's out there?" Eleanor asked, her voice low but laced with panic. "I don't know, but we can't stick around to find out," Marco replied. They slipped out through the opposite side of the building, Marco leading her across the deserted grounds. The car was parked a few hundred meters away, but every step felt agonizingly slow. Eleanor kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows, but the silence remained unbroken. When they finally reached the car, Marco started the engine quickly and sped away from the village. He didn't speak again until they were far from the ruins. "Eleanor, this isn't just about Richard," he said, his voice grim. "If someone knows you're here, your life could be in danger too." A chill ran down her spine. For the first time, she realized just how vulnerable she was. Until now, it had all felt distant, like a story that didn't quite involve her. But now it was real. And it was terrifying. She held Richard's photo in her lap, staring at his features once more. "What do I do now, Marco?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. "Now," he replied, eyes fixed on the road, "you decide how far you're willing to go to find the truth." The silence in the car was stifling. Eleanor kept her gaze locked on the photo in her hands, as though she could uncover some hidden answer in Richard's expression. But all she found was a growing sense of emptiness and anger. "You want me to trust you, but all you've done is feed me scraps of information," she said at last, her voice thick with frustration. "I don't know anything, Marco. Nothing. If you want me to believe you, then tell me the truth. All of it." Marco sighed, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. He looked reluctant, but it was clear he had no choice. "All right," he said after a long pause. "I'll tell you what I know. But what you're about to hear, it might change everything you believe about Richard." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat, but she nodded slowly. She was done with half-truths. "Start from the beginning." Marco drew a deep breath before speaking. "Richard was a brilliant man, Eleanor. But sometimes his curiosity got the better of him. 3 years ago, he was working on a project for a construction company with very dangerous connections. Eastern European and Italian firms involved in money laundering, trafficking, and other crimes." Eleanor frowned. Richard never mentioned anything like that. He was just an architect. "Yes, he was," Marco confirmed. "But he was also an architect who liked to understand everything. He started noticing discrepancies in the financial documents he was asked to review. At some point, he uncovered something he shouldn't have, records of transactions and properties tied to illegal activity. At first, he tried to ignore it, but Richard wasn't the kind of man who could turn a blind eye." Marco's words made sense, but they left her with even more questions. If he knew about this, why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he go to the police? "He didn't tell you because he was trying to protect you," Marco said softly. "And as for the police, what he discovered was bigger than that. It involved powerful people. He knew that if he tried to expose it, he and everyone he cared about would be silenced before he even had the chance. Eleanor's chest tightened. The thought of Richard carrying this burden alone, without even hinting at it to her, was almost unbearable. So what did he do? He came to me, Marco replied. At the time, I was already investigating some of these organizations. He handed me the documents he'd uncovered, but that immediately put him in danger. They found out he knew. That's why he disappeared. Marco's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor gripped Richard's photo more tightly. You're telling me he faked his own death? Marco nodded. It was the only way to keep you safe. Richard knew that as long as they believed he was dead, you'd be out of harm's way. Eleanor shook her head slowly, struggling to process everything. Her mind felt overloaded with information that seemed impossible to accept. So he's alive, she said, more to herself than to Marco. But why hasn't he come back? Why hasn't he reached out to me? Marco hesitated before answering, his expression grim. Because he's still being hunted, Eleanor. And now that you're involved, you are too. The revelation hit her like a punch to the stomach. This is your fault, she said, her voice growing firmer. You're the one who put him in this position. You should have protected him. Marco abruptly pulled the car onto the shoulder of the road and turned to face her, his eyes intense. You think I didn't try? You think it's easy to protect someone when you're up against criminals with more resources than we could ever hope for? Richard made his choices. He knew exactly what he was doing. Eleanor didn't reply immediately. The anger she felt towards Marco was tangled up with the anger she felt towards Richard and herself. The man she loved was alive, but the cost of that was a mountain of secrets and pain. And now, she finally asked, her voice low. What do I do now? Marco leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath before answering. Now, you decide how much you really want to know. Because there's more, Eleanor. And every answer comes with a price. She stared at him, trying to grasp what he meant. But the only thing she knew for sure was that, after everything she'd just heard, there was no going back. Eleanor ran her hands over her face, trying to organize her thoughts, which felt like water slipping through her fingers. It was all too much. The story, the revelations, the fact that Richard was alive, but buried under layers of secrets and threats. And now, she was suddenly tangled up in it all. Why now, Marco? She broke the silence, her voice hoarse and edged with frustration. Why, after 3 years, has someone decided to drag me into this? Why not sooner? Marco hesitated, as though carefully choosing his words. It's complicated, he began, but Eleanor's impatient glare forced him to continue quickly. Over the past few years, they had no reason to suspect you. As far as they were concerned, Richard was dead, and you, well, you weren't a threat. But recently, something changed. Something changed? Eleanor repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. How convenient. I know how it sounds, Marco said, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. But, Eleanor, listen, someone found out Richard's alive. She froze, the words not making sense at first. How? We're not sure, Marco admitted. It could have been a mistake on his part, or maybe someone close to him said too much. The point is, they're suspicious, and they've started digging. And when that happened, you became a target, because you're the only link left between him and his old life. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. So that's it? Her voice was bitter. They think they can use me to get to him? Marco nodded slowly. Essentially, yes. And that's why I reached out to you. If you were on your own, unaware of what was going on, they could manipulate you, follow you, or worse. We need to stay ahead of them. Eleanor's anger swelled with every word. She didn't know if she was more furious at Marco, Richard, or the absurd situation she was now in. So, you only brought me here because I'm a liability. Is that it? It's not just that, Marco said firmly. I brought you here because you deserve to know the truth. And because, Eleanor, whether you believe it or not, Richard needs you. Those last words caught her off guard. He needs me, she repeated, incredulous. The same man who faked his death and left me alone for 3 years. How could he possibly need me? Marco looked at her with a steady gaze. Because you're the only person he trusts completely. And if you don't help him, he doesn't stand a chance against them. As much as she wanted to shout at Marco, Eleanor couldn't find the words. His statement hung in the air, weaving itself into her thoughts, mingling with her memories of Richard. The pain, the love, the anger, and that cruel flicker of hope she couldn't quite extinguish. She turned her head, trying to keep her emotions in check. So, what happens now? Marco started the car again, but this time the silence between them felt heavier. Now, I'm taking you somewhere safe, he said. And after that, we need to decide the next step. The car pulled up in front of a small hotel tucked away on a quiet street. Marco walked her to the room and locked the door behind them before speaking again. I know you're angry, he said, sitting down in the room's single chair. And you have every right to be. But I need you to think clearly now, Eleanor. They're watching you, and any wrong move could put both you and Richard in even more danger. Eleanor folded her arms and stared at him. And what's the brilliant plan, then? Marco unfolded a map of the region and laid it out on the table. I've tracked down someone who might be able to help us, he said. A man who used to work for the same organization that's after Richard. He left years ago, but he still has valuable contacts. He could tell us where Richard is. And how do you know we can trust him? I don't trust him completely, Marco admitted. But he's our best chance. Eleanor stayed silent for a moment, staring at the map without really seeing it. Part of her wanted to run, to catch the next flight home and pretend none of this was happening. But another part, the part that still loved Richard, despite everything, knew there was no turning back now. I'll go with you, she said at last, her voice steady. But, Marco, if this is some kind of trap. It's not, he said quickly. I promise. She held his gaze for a long moment before looking away again. There was something about Marco she couldn't figure out, something that made her want to trust him but also left her wary. As he went over the details of the plan, Eleanor felt the pressure mounting. She still wasn't sure if she wanted to find Richard or if she had the strength to face what came next. But one thing was certain, there was no way back. The next morning, the sound of Eleanor's phone alarm echoed through the small hotel room. She opened her eyes slowly, feeling the weight of sleeplessness pressing down on her. The previous night had been a torment, the information Marco had given her seemed impossible to process. Richard being alive, the organization hunting him, her own involvement in it all. It felt like her life had spiraled completely out of control. As she splashed her face in the cramped bathroom, Eleanor looked at her reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at her felt like a stranger's, sunken eyes, a weary expression. This wasn't the face of someone strong, it was the face of someone on the verge of breaking. She returned to the room and found Marco at the table, going over papers and maps. He looked calm, focused, but Eleanor knew the tension weighed on him just as much. "Ready?" he asked, not looking up. Eleanor let out a heavy sigh before answering. "I don't know if I'm ready for anything, Marco. But let's just get this over with." Marco nodded, closing the papers and gesturing for her to follow him. "The man we're meeting is called Luca," he explained as they walked to the car. "He worked as a go-between for the organization. He knows where Richard was hiding, at least, up until recently." "And why would he just tell us that?" Eleanor asked, her tone skeptical. Marco hesitated for a moment before replying. "Let's just say he has his own reasons for helping. He left the organization for personal reasons and has no loyalty to them anymore. But don't expect him to be friendly." The car set off towards the hills outside Rome, winding along a narrow road lined with cypress trees. Marco kept his eyes on the road while Eleanor stared out the window, trying to ignore the growing fear inside her. "Why do you trust Luca so much?" she asked, breaking the suffocating silence. "I don't trust him completely," Marco replied, his voice neutral. "But he's the one who tipped me off about Richard in the first place. Without him, I wouldn't have found the photo, or you." Eleanor didn't respond. She still didn't know what to feel about the photo. Part of her wanted to believe it was proof Richard was alive. Another part feared it was a cruel trick, something designed to manipulate her. The car finally pulled up in front of a small stone house, surrounded by tall trees. The building was isolated, as though hidden on purpose. Marco switched off the engine and turned to Eleanor. "Remember, he's not our friend," he said. "Luca's pragmatic. He'll help us because it suits him, not because he cares." Eleanor nodded, trying to hide her nerves. They stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, where Marco knocked firmly. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and tired but sharp eyes. He looked at Marco first, then at Eleanor, sizing her up as if he were trying to figure her out. "Marco," Luca said, his voice low and gravelly. "You've brought company this time." "She's Richard's wife," Marco replied bluntly. Luca raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. He turned his gaze back to Eleanor, this time with a touch more curiosity. "So, you're Eleanor Whittaker," he said, as though the name carried some weight. "I've heard a lot about you." "I'm not sure if that's good or bad," Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Luca gave a faint smile, but said nothing more. He stepped aside and gestured for them to enter, leading them to a modest sitting room with old furniture and piles of books and papers scattered everywhere. "Is Richard alive?" Eleanor asked directly, cutting through the silence. She had no patience for small talk. Luca studied her for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said at last. "But where he is now, that's something you'll have to figure out." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "What's that supposed to mean? You don't know where he is?" "I did," Luca replied, picking up a stack of papers from a nearby pile. "But he's gone off the grid again. He's moving constantly to avoid being caught. The last time I had news of him was a few months ago." He placed an envelope on the table and gestured for Marco and Eleanor to take it. "This is everything I know. Details about Richard's last known movements, contacts he's used, places he's stayed. If you want to find him, it's a good place to start." Eleanor reached for the envelope carefully, feeling as though she were holding a piece of her own soul. She looked at Luca, searching for any sign he might be lying, but his face was unreadable. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. Luca gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I owe Richard. And if you manage to find him, maybe you'll be able to do what I couldn't, save him." Eleanor clutched the envelope tightly as Marco started the car. The silence between them was as heavy as the weight she felt in her chest. She didn't know what to expect from its contents, but one thing was clear: every answer would bring more questions. Back at the hotel, she wasted no time. Sitting at the small desk, she placed the envelope in front of her, her hands trembling as she opened it. Marco stood by the window, watching her in silence, giving her the space she needed to take in what she was about to uncover. The envelope contained a mix of papers and photographs. Some were handwritten notes, lists of contacts and addresses. Others appeared to be financial records, harmless on the surface, but clearly masking something deeper. There were also several photographs of Richard in various locations, all taken from a distance. Eleanor picked up the first photograph, a heart tightening in her chest. It was Richard, no question about it, sitting at an outdoor cafe table. He looked deep in thought, his eyes fixed on something out of frame. Another photo showed him walking through a busy market, dressed simply, wearing a hat that seemed like a deliberate attempt to stay unnoticed. "He looks normal," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "Normal doesn't mean safe," Marco replied, stepping closer to the desk. "The places he's been spotted, they are transit points. He doesn't stay in one place for long." Eleanor kept sifting through the papers. Among the notes, one detail caught her attention: a name and a date. The name was Villavento, and the date was marked as 3 months prior. "What's this?" she asked, holding the paper up to Marco. He took the paper and scanned it quickly. "Villavento, it's a property on the coast. Isolated, but it's been used by certain members of the organization for important meetings. If Richard was there, it means he's still trying to gather information. Or it means he's been captured," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. Marco shook his head. "If they'd captured him, they wouldn't be investigating you. They'd be using him to get to you." She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to take it all in. It felt like an endless nightmare. When she opened them again, her attention was drawn to a scribbled note in the corner of another sheet of paper: "Trust Luca, but never completely." Eleanor frowned and showed the paper to Marco. "Did Richard write this?" Marco looked at the note and nodded slowly. "Yes. It seems like he left it as a warning. Luca can be useful, but Richard knew he couldn't rely on him entirely." Eleanor tossed the papers back onto the table, exasperated. "I don't know what to believe anymore. First, Richard fakes his own death, and now he's leaving cryptic warnings like he's in some kind of spy thriller." Marco placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression serious. "I know it's a lot. But, Eleanor, you're closer to finding him than you've been in 3 years. These papers, this note, they are the path forward." She pushed back from the table, folding her arms. "And what if he doesn't want to be found, Marco? What if I show up and he tells me I should never have come?" Marco sighed. "Then at least you'll have the answers you've been searching for. At least you'll know the truth." Eleanor knew he was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. She looked down at the last photograph of Richard, his face so familiar and yet so distant. "Villavento," she murmured. "That's the next step, isn't it?" Marco nodded. "Yes. It's the only solid lead we've got." She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a resolve in her that even she hadn't realized she possessed. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. Marco grabbed the car keys but paused to look at her seriously before they left. "You know, after this, there's no going back." Eleanor gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I passed the point of no return a long time ago, Marco." The road to Villa Venta was narrow and winding, flanked by rolling hills and olive trees stretching as far as the eye could see. Eleanor watched the scenery pass by, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a whirlwind of memories and doubts. Marco drove in silence, focused, occasionally glancing at her as if trying to gauge her state of mind. When they finally arrived, the property was anything but inviting. Villa Venta was a large, weathered building, its stone walls worn by time and its tall windows staring out like hollow eyes. The place had an air of abandonment, but something about it hinted that it still held secrets. Marco parked the car at a safe distance, on a narrow track surrounded by trees. "We'll go on foot from here," he said, pulling a backpack from the back seat. He looked at her intently. "Are you ready?" Eleanor nodded, though she knew she could never truly be ready for whatever they might find there. As they approached the villa, the silence around them grew almost suffocating. Marco's eyes darted constantly, scanning every detail of their surroundings as they walked. Eleanor, meanwhile, felt her heart pounding harder with each step. Every movement seemed to echo in her mind like a countdown to something inevitable. "Marco," she whispered, trying to steady her nerves. "What exactly are we looking for here?" "Any sign that Richard was here," he replied, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. "If he used this place as a meeting point, he might have left something behind." They finally reached the main entrance. Marco pushed the door open cautiously, revealing an empty hall with marble floors, thick with dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy, carrying the smell of dampness and old wood. "Stay close to me," Marco said, switching on a torch. Eleanor followed silently, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Each room they passed seemed more desolate than the last, but Marco moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where to go. They climbed a narrow staircase and entered an office that looked like it had been used recently. A wooden desk sat cluttered with papers and maps, with a half-empty bottle of wine beside a chair. Marco started sifting through the items, while Eleanor drifted towards a bookcase lined with old books. Something caught her attention. In the corner of the shelf, hidden behind other books, was a small black notebook. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with Richard's familiar handwriting. "Marco," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. He was at her side in an instant, leaning over her shoulder. "What is it?" he asked. Eleanor began to read aloud, her voice faltering. "If someone finds this, it means I'm closer than ever. I can't go back to her yet, but everything I've done has been to protect her. Please, don't let them get to Eleanor." She stopped, a lump forming in her throat. The rest of the writing was fragmented, mentioning names and places she didn't recognize. Marco took the notebook and started flipping through it quickly. "This is a lead," he said, his tone urgent. He knew someone might find it. "This notebook is like a map. A guide to tracking him." Eleanor looked at him, tears threatening to spill. "Why didn't he just come back to me?" she asked, her voice heavy with pain. "Why did he hide and leave all this behind?" Marco placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. "He thought he was protecting you," he said. "And maybe he was right. But now, Eleanor, you have a choice, keep going, or walk away. She looked back at the notebook, her fingers gripping the cover tightly. Everything inside her screamed to stop, but something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain, pushed her forward. "I can't stop now," she said at last, her voice filled with determination. "I need to know the truth." The tension in the room was thick as Marco continued combing through the notebook, studying each note carefully. He stopped at a page where Richard had drawn what looked like a small map, marked with coordinates. "These coordinates," Marco murmured, narrowing his eyes. "They are not far from here. He must have used another hideout nearby." "Another place?" Eleanor asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "How much longer are we going to chase clues? I need to see him, Marco. I need answers." Marco nodded, but his tone remained cautious. "We're close, Eleanor. But we have to be careful. If he's still here, it means he's still in hiding." The drive to the marked coordinates was short, but each minute felt like an eternity for Eleanor. The car wound its way down a dirt road, surrounded by open fields and gentle hills. When they finally stopped, they were in front of a small wooden cabin, partially concealed by dense trees. Marco got out first, moving carefully, and motioned for Eleanor to stay behind him. She obeyed, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Every step towards the cabin felt heavier, as if something unseen was holding her back. As they approached, Marco raised a hand, signaling for silence. He knocked lightly on the door, the sound echoing in the still afternoon air. For a moment, nothing happened. Eleanor held her breath, straining to hear anything. And then, the door creaked open slowly, revealing the figure of a man. "Richard." Eleanor felt the world stop. He was right there, standing in front of her. His face looked different, older, marked with lines of exhaustion that hadn't been there before. He had a faint beard and dark circles under his eyes, but his eyes, the eyes she knew so well, were exactly the same. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough but heavy with emotion. She froze, unable to speak. Every word she had imagined saying to him over the past 3 years vanished in that moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she found her voice. "Why did you leave me?" Richard sighed, running a hand over his face as if searching for the right words. "I never wanted to leave you," he said at last. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Her voice rose, trembling with anger and pain. "You think leaving me to believe you were dead was protection? You think that was fair?" "I know it seems unfair," he replied, his voice breaking. "But, Eleanor, you have to understand. I didn't have a choice. I uncovered things that put both our lives at risk. They wanted to use me. They wanted to get to you. The only way to keep you safe was to disappear." Eleanor stepped forward, tears finally streaming down her face. "And you think that made me feel safe? You think that gave me peace? I've spent 3 years without you, Richard. 3 years thinking I'd lost everything." Richard lowered his head, guilt etched across his face. "I never wanted that for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But every step I took was to make sure they never found you. And when I heard they were starting to investigate you, I knew I was running out of time." "Then why didn't you come back sooner?" she demanded, her voice thick with hurt. "Why didn't you trust me?" "Because I couldn't take that risk," Richard said, meeting her gaze. "I couldn't risk them finding you or our child." His words hit her like a bolt of lightning. She stood frozen, trying to process what he had just said. "Our child," she repeated, disbelief in her voice. Richard nodded slowly. "I knew, Eleanor. Before I disappeared, I knew you were pregnant. That's why I had to do it. I had to make sure he had a chance to live safely, away from all of this." She felt her body tremble, a flood of shock, anger, and longing washing over her all at once. Before she could respond, Marco cut in. "Richard, they are still after you. And now they know about Eleanor. We need to move quickly." Richard nodded but kept his eyes locked on Eleanor. "I know nothing I say can make up for what I've done," he said. "But everything I did for you. For both of you. And I've never stopped thinking about you. Not for a second." Eleanor wanted to scream, to cry, to hit him, but more than anything, she wanted to hold him. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around him, tears falling freely. "I hate you for this," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "But I also never stopped loving you." Richard held her just as tightly, as if clinging to her was the only thing keeping him together. "I'm so sorry," he whispered back. "But I'm going to fix this. I'm going to protect you, Eleanor. You and our son. I won't fail again." The cabin was steeped in a tense silence after their reunion. Richard, Marco, and Eleanor stood in the small room, each lost in their own thoughts. But there wasn't much time for emotions. A greater threat loomed outside, and they all knew it. Richard was the first to break the silence. "They know you're here. Time isn't on our side." He turned to Marco, his expression serious. "Do you still have a line to Luca?" "Yes," Marco replied. "He gave us information about your last movements, but if we found the coordinates, it's possible they're closing in too." Eleanor, seated at the table with Richard's notebook in front of her, lifted her head. "No more secrets," she said firmly. "We need answers now. You knew you were being hunted. You knew they could get to me and our son. So why are you still on the move? What are you trying to do, Richard?" Richard looked at her, his eyes weary but resolute. "They're hiding something, Eleanor. Something big. It's not just about money or illegal deals. It's bigger than that. I found documents, references to secret projects, things that could have devastating consequences. I had to keep investigating, even with the risks." Marco crossed his arms and stepped in. "You saying this isn't just about you? That there's something larger at stake?" Richard nodded. "Yes. If we can expose what they're doing, we can take this organization down for good." Eleanor shook her head, incredulous. "You honestly think you can take on people like this? Look at yourself, Richard. You've been hiding for 3 years, and it still hasn't stopped them from reaching us." "I know," he replied, his voice low. "But now I have you. I can't do this alone, but together, we can find the evidence and get it to the right people. And most importantly, we can make sure you and our son are safe." The word together hung heavily in the air, both a promise and a plea. Eleanor was still angry, but she knew he was right. There was no turning back now. Marco glanced between the two of them, his expression serious. "If we're doing this, we need a plan. Luca can help with contacts and intel, but we've got to move fast. The longer we stay here, the higher the chances of being found." Richard nodded and moved towards a rucksack in the corner of the room. He pulled out documents and maps, spreading them across the table. "The next place we need to investigate is a property in Naples," he said. It used to be one of their main meeting points. If there's anything left there, it could be the key to everything. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to process what was ahead. And what if it's a trap? What if they already know you're alive and are waiting for you there? Then we need to stay a step ahead, Richard replied, his gaze steady. But we don't have a choice. They won't stop until they get what they want. Marco picked up the map, studying the location in Naples. I know someone in the city who can help us get in without attracting attention. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Eleanor watched as the two of them planned, feeling a mix of fear and determination. For the first time in years, she was part of something she didn't fully understand but knew was important. It was terrifying, but it also felt inevitable. I'm coming with you, she said suddenly, her voice firm. Richard turned to her, his eyes wide with alarm. Eleanor, no. Don't tell me to stay behind, she cut him off. I didn't come all this way to be sidelined again. If this is about us, then I'm seeing it through. I want answers, Richard. I want to know what you found and why it's cost us so much. Richard stared at her for a moment before nodding slowly. All right, he said. But you stay with me the whole time. Promise me you'll listen to me. She crossed her arms, her eyes defiant. Only if you promise to stop treating me like I can't handle this. Marco, watching the exchange with a neutral expression, interrupted. Sorry to break this up, but we need to move now. If we're heading to Naples, we need to leave before sunrise. A few hours later, the three of them were back on the road, the weight of the mission heavy on their shoulders. Marco drove, Richard sat in the passenger seat, and Eleanor was in the back, staring out of the window. The Italian countryside rushed past, but her mind was stuck on Richard's last words, they won't stop until they get what they want. She still didn't know if she was ready to uncover the full truth, but she knew she had to keep going. There was no turning back now. And, for the first time, she felt like she was facing it all with him by her side. The road to Naples felt endless. Although the distance wasn't particularly far, the tension in the car made time stretch unbearably. Eleanor switched between watching the scenery blur past and observing Richard in the rearview mirror. He was quiet, lost in thought, his fingers drumming on his knee, an old habit she immediately recognized. Who's this contact we're meeting? She asked, breaking the silence. Marco glanced at her in the mirror, his expression calm but guarded. A man called Salvatore. He was a low-level middleman in the organization, but left a few years back. He works in transport now, mostly down at the port. He keeps track of shipments coming and going and might know if something suspicious is being moved. Richard nodded. Salvatore's always been discreet. But we'll need to be careful. He's not trustworthy, just useful. All your allies seem to be like that, Eleanor shot back, her tone sharp. Richard sighed but didn't respond. She wasn't wrong, and he knew it. Eleanor, meanwhile, felt torn between the urge to challenge him and the understanding that now wasn't the time. When they arrived in Naples, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The city was alive, buzzing with the sounds of car horns, chatter, and the salty scent of the sea mingled with the aroma of street food. Marco navigated the car through narrow, crowded streets until they pulled into an alley near the port. He should be around here, Marco said, switching off the engine. Stay sharp. The three of them stepped out of the car, and Marco led them to a small workshop at the end of the alley. Outside, a stocky man with graying hair leaned against the wall, smoking a cigarette. When he spotted Marco, he raised his head, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Marco," the man said, his voice gravelly with a faint Neapolitan lilt. "You've brought company. Are you sure that's safe?" "Salvatore," Marco greeted him evenly. "We're here about Richard Whittaker." At the mention of the name, Salvatore's eyes narrowed further. He turned his gaze to Richard, studying him for a moment before letting out a short, dry laugh. "So, the ghost decides to show up." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. It wasn't just the way Salvatore spoke, but the weight of what he implied. Richard was a man many believed to be dead, yet his presence still loomed over everyone. "We need information," Marco said bluntly. "Do you know what they are moving through the port? We're looking for evidence to bring this organization down." Salvatore took a long drag on his cigarette before answering. "You lot realize what you're asking, don't you? Messing with these people isn't child's play. They don't forgive, and they don't forget. That's exactly why we need the information," Richard said, stepping forward. "I know the risks, but I also know you want to see them fall as much as we do." Salvatore stared at Richard for a long moment, as though weighing whether getting involved was worth the trouble. Finally, he stubbed his cigarette out on the ground and opened the workshop door. "Come with me." Inside, the workshop smelled faintly of oil and rust. Salvatore went to an old laptop, tapping away until a series of documents and spreadsheets appeared on the screen. "I've noticed something strange the last few weeks," he began as he typed. "They are moving containers through the port, but the records don't add up. Some shipments are marked confidential, and no one's allowed anywhere near them." Eleanor leaned closer, watching the screen as Salvatore pulled up a list of dates and container numbers. Marco leaned in as well, scrutinizing the data. "These containers," Marco said, pointing at the screen. "Do you know where they are being stored?" "Yeah," Salvatore replied. "Warehouse 17. It's one of the most secure spots at the port. But if you're planning on taking a look, you'd better move fast. The last shipment's leaving tomorrow night." "And what's in those containers?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with urgency. Salvatore shrugged. "No idea. But if they're hiding something, that's where you'll find it." Richard turned to Marco, determination etched on his face. "We need to get to the warehouse. Tonight." Eleanor felt a wave of fear course through her body. "Are you serious? Breaking into a secured warehouse? That's suicide, Richard." "I know it's risky," he replied, turning to face her. "But it's that or running forever. We need solid evidence, Eleanor. This might be our only chance." Salvatore let out a quiet laugh, folding his arms. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't keep you alive. If you're going, make sure no one sees you." Marco collected the necessary information as Salvatore led them back to the alley. "Good luck," Salvatore said, lighting another cigarette. "You'll need it." Eleanor felt the weight of the situation grow heavier as they returned to the car. She knew Richard was right, but that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. "If we're doing this, we need a plan," Marco said, starting the engine. Richard nodded, but Eleanor stayed silent, staring out the window. Warehouse 17 was the next step, and she knew whatever they found there could change everything, for better or worse. The port of Naples lay quiet under the cover of darkness. Though there was still the occasional movement of trucks and workers, most of the area was deserted, long shadows stretching from the high floodlights scattered across the warehouses. Marco parked the car a few streets away, leaving the group to cover the rest of the distance on foot. Remember, Marco whispered as they crouched behind a stack of crates, this needs to be quick. We get what we need and get out. No heroics. Richard nodded silently beside Eleanor. She, however, was less sure. Her heart thumped like a drum as she stared at Warehouse 17, its large, imposing structure standing out in the dimly lit port. She clutched Richard's note in her pocket, a small anchor keeping her from giving in to the fear. This way, Marco gestured, leading them through a narrow path between stacked containers. They moved silently, carefully avoiding cameras and the occasional guard patrolling the area. When they reached the warehouse, Marco stopped and turned to Richard. The main entrance is a no-go. We'll use the side door. There's a service entrance that should be unlocked. Approaching the door cautiously, Marco pulled a small toolkit from his backpack. He began working on the lock while Richard and Eleanor kept watch. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night, and Eleanor felt as though each passing second stretched on forever. Finally, the lock clicked, and Marco pushed the door open, motioning for them to follow. Inside, the warehouse was vast and stifling, the air thick and stale. The space stretched out into rows of containers stacked high, reaching towards the ceiling. A faint light illuminated the main aisle, but the rest of the space was swallowed by shadows. The marked containers are at the back, Marco whispered, pointing in the direction indicated on Salvatore's map. They moved carefully, every step deliberate to avoid making noise. Eleanor was on high alert, her eyes darting around the dimly lit space. Still, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. When they reached the far end of the warehouse, they found the containers listed in Salvatore's records. Marco approached the nearest one and began working on the latch. The metallic clink of the lock echoed in the empty space, making Eleanor hold her breath. Finally, the container door creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside were smaller crates, each sealed with the logo of a fake shipping company. Richard grabbed one of the crates and carefully pried it open. What they found inside was not what Eleanor had expected. Documents. Stacks of them. This is it? Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Documents? They are hiding paperwork? Richard quickly sifted through the papers, his hands moving with urgency. His expression changed as he read, his eyes widening in disbelief. These aren't just papers, he said, his voice low but charged with intensity. They are contracts. Financial records. Entire schemes laid out. Marco leaned over Richard's shoulder. This is enough to bring them down, he said, his voice tense. But we'll need to take everything. Eleanor began grabbing more boxes, helping to stack them into their bags. She didn't fully understand the details, but she could feel the weight of what they'd found. These documents were the answer, the evidence Richard had been searching for. This could expose everything, Richard went on, his voice almost breathless. This might not just destroy them, but protect you and our son for good. Eleanor paused for a moment, looking at him. For the first time in years, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, hope. Then let's take it and get out of here, she said, her tone firm. Marco nodded, but before they could move, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. We've got company, Marco whispered, pulling Eleanor and Richard behind a stack of crates. A group of men entered the warehouse, armed and clearly searching for something, or someone. Eleanor's heart pounded as they drew closer, but Marco gestured for them to stay silent. As the men passed, Marco whispered quickly. Side exit. We're leaving. Now. Carefully, the group began moving towards the service door. Every step felt like a gamble, but at last, they reached the door. Marco opened it slowly, and the three slipped out into the cool night air. Without wasting a moment, they sprinted back to the car. Once inside, Marco started the engine, and it roared to life as they sped away from the port. In the car, Richard clutched the bags of documents as if his life depended on them. Eleanor was breathless, but for the first time, she felt something new, the sense that they were finally one step ahead. She looked over at Richard, who met her gaze with a faint smile. "This is the beginning of the end," he said, his voice filled with determination. Eleanor nodded, taking his hand. "We'll finish this together." The car raced along the winding road, pulling further and further away from the port and the darkness that seemed to engulf everything in Naples. In the back seat, Eleanor watched Richard, who held the bags of documents firmly by his side, as though they were his final line of defense. Marco, in the driver's seat, kept his eyes fixed on the road, glancing at the mirrors to ensure they weren't being followed. "We need to find a safe place to go through all this," Marco said, his voice tight. "These documents are incredibly valuable, but they're just as dangerous. Now that we've got them, they'll know." Richard nodded, still catching his breath from their escape. "Salvatore mentioned someone in Rome, someone reliable who can help us organize this. If we can digitize the files and get them to the right contacts, we can ensure they reach international authorities." "And you think they don't have people planted in the authorities?" Eleanor asked, skepticism laced in her tone. "This is way bigger than just filing a report." "She's right," Marco said, gripping the wheel. "We can't trust anyone blindly. We need to find someone who's completely outside their reach." Eleanor folded her arms, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "And who would that be? Because, honestly, no one we've met so far seems remotely trustworthy." Richard finally turned to her, his expression serious. "There's someone," he said, his voice calmer now. "An investigative journalist. Clara Benedetti. She left mainstream media years ago and works independently now, exposing networks like this. If we give this to her, she can make sure the information goes public before they have the chance to cover it up." Marco shook his head slowly. "That could work. But only if we get to her before they do." The next few hours were spent in silence as the group headed towards Rome. Marco drove without stopping, while Eleanor and Richard worked through the most critical documents. Each page Eleanor read seemed to peel back another layer of secrets and corruption, human trafficking schemes, multi-million euro transactions between shell accounts, bribes to politicians and multinational corporations. "This is horrific," Eleanor murmured, holding one of the reports with trembling hands. "These people aren't just criminals, they are murderers. How many lives have been destroyed to keep this running?" Richard placed his hand over hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know," he said, his expression weighed down. "That's why we have to expose it. And that's why I couldn't come back until I had something like this." She stared at him, still wrestling with a blend of anger and understanding. "You should have told me. I could have helped." "I know," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "But I was scared. Not of you, but of losing you. And, Eleanor, I did lose you. And that was worse than anything they could have done to me." His words disarmed her. She looked away, blinking back tears that threatened to fall, but she knew this wasn't the moment to break down. When they finally arrived in Rome, Marco led them to a small flat in the suburbs, which he described as a temporary safe house. The building was old and plain, but equipped with everything they needed: a computer, a scanner, and a secure internet connection. Clara's here in Rome, Marco said as he powered up the computer. I'll contact her discreetly. In the meantime, we need to scan these documents. The sooner we start, the better. Eleanor and Richard got to work, scanning document after document while Marco focused on reaching Clara. The process was painstakingly slow, but with each page digitized, they felt a step closer to exposing the truth. Hours later, Marco returned to the room, phone in hand. I got through, he said, relief in his voice. Clara's agreed to meet us tomorrow morning. But she wants it in a public place, to minimize risk. Eleanor glanced at Richard, trying to gauge his reaction. He looked exhausted but resolute. That's good, Richard said. The sooner we get this to her, the better. But we need to be ready. They are not going to sit back and watch this all fall apart. Eleanor knew he was right. The sense of danger was ever present, like a shadow clinging to them. But for the first time, she felt like they had something that could shift the balance in their favor. The next morning, they met Clara at a modest cafe in the heart of Rome. The journalist was a striking woman with a commanding presence, short hair, and piercing eyes that seemed to cut through everything. She listened intently as Richard and Marco laid out the situation, her face remaining serious as she leafed through the documents they had brought. This is devastating, she said at last, looking up at them. With this data, I can connect the dots between their operations in multiple countries. But you need to understand, once this comes out, there's no going back. You'll be their first targets. Eleanor felt the weight of those words. But when she looked at Richard, she saw something else, an unshakable resolve. If this takes them down, it'll be worth it, Richard said. We've spent too long running. It's time to fight back. Clara nodded. Then let's do this properly, she said. I'll start organizing the publication, but I'll need time. In the meantime, you need to disappear. Eleanor gripped Richard's hand under the table, her heart racing. The end was in sight, but she knew the worst was yet to come. The hours that followed were a race against time. Clara promised to release the documents through the right channels, ensuring the truth was revealed simultaneously and on a massive scale. But she also warned them that the first signs of publication would almost certainly trigger alarms among the organization's members. Eleanor, Richard, and Marco returned to the safe house, where the tension was almost suffocating. The group knew that once the documents were made public, retaliation would be inevitable. They needed a plan, not just to protect themselves, but to ensure that everything was exposed without interference. Marco closed the laptop and looked at Richard. Clara is set to publish at dawn. But we need to create a distraction to make sure they can't track us down before then. Richard nodded, leaning over the table. Then we need to predict their next move. They'll try to trace Clara or the location where the documents were uploaded. We need to be far from both. Eleanor crossed her arms, frowning. And how exactly do we do that? They've got endless resources. We're clearly outmatched. Marco shrugged, his face serious. They've got resources, sure. But we've got something they don't, you. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Me? What's that supposed to mean? You're the perfect bait, Marco said. They think Richard's only alive because of you. If they hear you're somewhere, they'll come running. That'll give us the time we need. Richard immediately shook his head. This is madness. She's not being used as bait. Not while I'm here. And what's your other plan, Richard? Marco shot back. Sit here and wait for them to find us? Because trust me, they will find us. Eleanor watched the two of them argue for a moment before raising her hand, cutting them off. I'll do it. Richard stared at her, stunned. Eleanor, no. She looked at him with unwavering determination. Richard, this isn't just about us. It's about our son. It's about all the people they've hurt. If it means exposing the truth, then I'll do whatever it takes. He fell silent, wrestling with the mixture of pride and fear he felt for her. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, he said. But I'm going with you. Marco shook his head. No. You need to stay far away from her. If they see you, it all falls apart. I'll go with Eleanor. You have to be the contingency plan, Richard. That night, Eleanor and Marco set out for a strategically visible but difficult to reach location, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of Rome. The plan was simple but dangerous, to create enough activity to draw the organization's attention while Clara completed the release of the documents. The factory was a maze of empty corridors, rusted structures, and scattered debris. Marco set up a laptop connected to a decoy network, simulating that the documents were being uploaded from there. Meanwhile, Eleanor stayed close, her heart pounding at every noise echoing around them. They'll come, Marco said, double-checking the setup. It's only a matter of time. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She thought of Richard, wherever he was, likely worrying about her as he waited for it all to play out. She knew he wanted to be here, protecting her, but this time, she had to be the strength he had always been for her. Not long after midnight, the sounds began. At first, cautious footsteps. Then the unmistakable rumble of vehicles pulling up outside. Marco glanced at her and motioned for silence. He held a gun at his side, but his focus was on escape rather than a fight. The organization had arrived. Men poured into the building, armed and methodical, sweeping the factory corridors. Eleanor and Marco stayed hidden in a back room, watching on a monitor as the decoy network misled the intruders, drawing them towards the wrong part of the factory. Now, Marco whispered, grabbing Eleanor's arm. They slipped out through a side exit, moving quickly away while the men searched the wrong area. But as they reached the outside, two men spotted them. Shouts erupted, followed by gunfire. Marco yanked Eleanor behind a pile of concrete rubble, firing back to keep the pursuers at bay. Run, he shouted at her. Eleanor hesitated, but the look in Marco's eyes was unmistakable. He was ready to stay behind to make sure she got away. She ran, her heart pounding as she fled the chaos. By dawn, Eleanor finally reached Richard, waiting at their pre-arranged meeting point outside the city. The moment he saw her, he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as though he'd never let her go again. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," she replied, exhausted but alive. Just then, Richard's phone buzzed. A message from Clara. She'd done it. The documents were being published across multiple platforms, accompanied by detailed analysis exposing the global scale of the corruption network. Eleanor looked at him, relief washing over her like a wave. "It's over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Richard pulled her closer, his eyes closing as he exhaled deeply. "Yes," he said. "It's finally over." But they both knew that while the battle had been won, the scars of the war would take time to heal. The days following the publication of the documents were a whirlwind. Clara Benedetti had delivered on her promise, exposing the organization across international networks, newspapers, and independent platforms. The undeniable evidence of corruption, human trafficking, and financial crime spread like wildfire, forcing governments and law enforcement agencies worldwide to act. Arrests were made. Politicians and executives were interrogated, while lower-level members of the organization scrambled to vanish. The public outcry was immense, and for the first time in years, the network seemed to be crumbling. But for Eleanor, Richard, and Marco, the victory came at a cost. Marco survived the confrontation at the factory, though not without injuries. He reappeared days later, sporting a faint smile despite the bandages on his arm. He met Richard and Eleanor in a quiet cafe to discuss what came next. "You two are in the clear now," he said, cradling a cup of coffee in his good hand. "They are falling apart, and no one's coming after you anymore. At least not the big players." Eleanor looked at him with gratitude. "And what about you? What will you do now?" Marco shrugged. "Me? I'll keep doing what I do. There's always another monster to hunt." Richard reached out, shaking Marco's hand firmly. "You saved our lives. I'll never forget that." Marco smiled, though there was something in his expression, a quiet understanding that his fight was far from over. Clara kept her word to the very end. She worked tirelessly to ensure the documents were safeguarded and released in a way that couldn't be silenced. But she knew her own life would never be the same. In a phone call with Eleanor, Clara explained that she'd decided to leave Italy for a while. "They might be collapsing," she said, "but there are still dangerous people out there. I'll keep working, but from a distance for now. You and Richard deserve some peace." Eleanor agreed, knowing Clara had put her own life on the line to expose the truth. Even though it seemed like everything was finally over, Eleanor and Richard both knew that rebuilding their lives would be the hardest challenge of all. The years they'd spent apart had left deep wounds, and Richard's decisions, no matter how justified, still lingered between them. A month later, they returned to London, finally reunited with the son Eleanor had raised alone for 3 years. The reunion was heart-wrenching. The boy ran into Richard's arms, not quite sure who he was but instinctively feeling the bond between father and son. "Are you staying now?" the boy asked, his voice innocent. Richard knelt down, holding him tightly. "I'm not going anywhere ever again," he promised, tears in his eyes. Eleanor watched from a distance, her heart heavy yet full of hope. Richard had returned, but she knew it would take time to trust him completely again. Even so, she was willing to try. Although the organization was crumbling, the fallout from the truth brought a new reality to the world. Investigations began in multiple countries, revealing a web of corruption that stretched into nearly every sector of society. For Richard and Eleanor, this meant staying cautious. Even with the organization weakened, there was always the risk of remnants seeking revenge. They decided to stay out of the spotlight, quietly rebuilding their lives far from public attention. One morning, a few months after their return, Eleanor found Richard in the kitchen, brewing coffee while scrolling through a small news article on his tablet. He seemed calmer than she had seen him in years. "What is it?" she asked, nodding toward the tablet. "Clara," he replied, showing her the screen. "She's just published another article. Looks like another faction of the group's been taken down." Eleanor gave a small smile as she sat down at the table. Well, at least something good came out of all this. Richard placed her coffee in front of her and sat beside her. "Something very good came out of it," he said, glancing at her and then toward the living room doorway, where their son was playing with a toy plane. Eleanor felt the warmth of his hand on hers, and, for the first time in a long while, a genuine sense of peace washed over her. Though the battle was over, Eleanor knew the scars of their experience would never fully fade. But as she looked at Richard and their son, she also realized there was something stronger than fear and pain, the power to start anew. They had faced the worst together, and now they had something that felt impossible just months ago, a second chance. And this time, they wouldn't waste it. As the sun set over the horizon, casting the small coastal town in golden hues, Eleanor and Richard sat on the porch of their new home, watching their son play in the garden. It was a simple scene, yet it carried so much meaning. After years of pain, uncertainty, and struggle, they finally had something they thought they'd lost forever, a future together. The journey they had faced wasn't just about exposing a criminal organization. It was about finding their way back to each other and to themselves, about understanding that true, unbreakable love can endure even the greatest of trials. Eleanor and Richard's story wasn't just about survival. It was about choice. They chose to face their fears. They chose the truth, even when it hurt. And, most importantly, they chose each other. Now, with the past finally behind them, they were ready to live fully, cherishing every moment. Because, as Richard had once said, it's never too late to start again. Want more stories like this? Share this journey with someone you love and let us know in the comments how you'd face life's toughest challenges. Follow our channel for more heartfelt narratives that inspire courage and hope. Click the subscribe button so you don't miss our next chapters, leave a like, and check out the video on your screen now. And remember, sometimes, it's in the storms that we find the strength to rebuild our lives. Until next time.